grateful for the opportunity that you give me to explain our commitment to collaborate with any initiatives that are about generating data and making the most of the data that already exists, and making sure that it's put to good use. Before I try to expand on some ways that we could collaborate even more closely, I'd like to make sure that we understand each other's roles so that we can start from there. And can I have the first slide, please? EMA has a central role in the assessment of new marketing authorizations. And I'm not seeing my first slide, but please, if you could move the slides. In fact, any new drugs that want to reach the market in oncology have to go through the assessment of EMA. So there is a very clear mandate in terms of the assessment of claims by the companies who want to obtain a marketing authorization. And the important aspect here is that it is the companies who submit the marketing authorization and we assess it. EMA does not conduct its independent, if you want, analysis and research to support any particular claim by companies. Could I have the next slide, please? So in all of our conversations, exploring possible collaborations and so on, it will be important to keep this in mind. On one hand, because we can't at the same time be generating data and assessing the data. And also because in the interaction with pharmaceutical companies, it is the companies who have the primary role of producing the evidence. So perhaps my first suggestion would be to focus on how Harmony can propose business cases that are attractive for companies in generating data to support their marketing authorization. And this has to do with activities that are done pre-authorization and post-authorization. And now I'd like to take you through some of the experience at regulatory level with companies using data from, let's say, outside purpose-conducted clinical trials. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, to start, I have to admit that we have rather limited experience with assessing data from external sources than the clinical trials submitted by the companies. And perhaps the more critical place where one would see a role for such data is when there is a need for external controls, either because there are multiple comparisons and then the randomized trials reasonably can only address one or two comparisons, or when there are developments conducted on the basis of single-arm trials and really relying on external comparisons for establishing a treatment effect in terms of endpoints like survival or progression-free survival of quality of life. So the clinically relevant endpoints we all want to know about when we assess drugs. Well, in all of these circumstances, I have to say our experience is limited, so the jury is still out there. But the main difficulty is still one of the risk of bias due to various methodological pitfalls. Let me just group them under the name of selection bias when it comes to external sources, which as of today, despite sophisticated methodologies, have not yet reached, I would say, the regulatory practice in terms of being clearly acceptable in all situations. Now, these are approaches that are often used to support stronger data from either randomized trials or to answer questions that are a little bit secondary, more exploratory in nature. So there is here another recommendation that whenever we're looking at really research questions and how they can be addressed with sources of data like Harmony, that we look at the methodologies and what type of answers we can get from those. Okay, I'm sure there will be a lot of opportunities to improve our methodology, but we also need to be stepwise and have a systematic approach in establishing these new methodologies. Can I have the next slide, please? So this was about the role of real-world data and other sources of evidence in the pre-authorization setting to support claims for marketing authorization. But we do recognize that that is just the first step. Of course, when drugs come to the market, then there is a wealth of other information that becomes important, how the drugs are used in practice, on label, and even sometimes off label. And there is a great opportunity, of course, to look at real-world data. Actually, it becomes more important in terms of sources to look at real-world data than the somewhat more clean, but let's say controlled setting of data generated from clinical trials. And we'll come back to this, but in the next slide, we have for years advocated that we really need to get our act together in trying to make the most of the data that is generated by the healthcare systems in such a way that the healthcare systems themselves can then reap the benefits and learn from these data. Next slide, please. And we have also recently started an initiative on big data, what we call the Darwin Initiative, which is part of the creation of a European health data space. And it's really very much about electronic health record and finding ways to federate data from different sources and so on. So my third suggestion here will be that we need to really work together with Harmony here and understand how we can collaborate, learn from each other, and also synergize. I'm sure there are a lot of opportunities here. But for what type of analysis and what type of data? Can I have the next slide, please? So in the post-marketing authorization here, our role becomes much less the one of establishing claims for products of companies seeking marketing authorizations, but it's more about monitoring safety, for example, monitoring news, providing evidence for different uses of drugs that might perhaps push academics or developers to seek marketing authorization in different indications, and that obviously through the companies, and other sort of side questions like understanding what groups benefit most, how the drugs are used in real practice, all of the aspects which we consider extremely important, although it's somewhat outside our strict remit of treatment optimization. And all of these aspects, I think, are a fertile ground for exploration using real-world evidence, and hence that's the opportunity to collaborate. We have our own initiatives, but we should be collaborating strongly. Now, whenever we discuss this type of data and questions, the issue of quality comes out. And can I have the next slide, please? Understandably, with a rigor that is imposed for clinical trials, largely by regulators. Can I have the next slide, please? There is a fear that the regulatory standard for data acceptance are incredibly high. And I think there is often a misinterpretation and an over-interpretation actually of regulatory requirements. I think we like to say at least, and we're happy to be challenged on this, and EHA, by the way, has been very constructive in its criticism to over bureaucratic approaches to data collection and data quality, and we're fully in line with those sentiments. So we're happy to be challenged, but we like to say that the quality of the data really should only be as good as deserved to answer the research question which is considered worthwhile asking. And so often these are not a rigid criteria of quality, but they are adaptive and hopefully with an approach that is sensible and proportionate to the research questions. What is often more the problem when one looks at these more exploratory data is not so much the data quality per se, so the precision of the data collection, but it's more, again, one of bias and how to ensure that selection bias and similar type of biases are minimized. And there again, we find that for a certain number of questions, real-world data might be more informative because it has higher external validity if it's collected appropriately than the highly selected data that one gets through clinical trial. So another suggestion really will be that all of these activities for collaboration that we may envisage take into account what are the best data, whether it's highly curated data from clinical trials or whether it's perhaps less precise but more externally valid data coming from real-world evidence sources appropriately collected. And the next slide, please. In all of these analyses and research questions, I come back to this again and again. The research methodologies are still under development and require systematic evaluation before regulators, but not just regulators, the highest scientific community as a whole is convinced that these methods are okay to minimize the problems of biases and so on. And if ever it came to that, I think you might be interested in knowing that some of these methodologies can be so-called qualified, so there can be a regulatory review just on a methodology rather than on a, I don't know, on a claim or on a drug. And this is actually an approach that can be done also generally, like methodologies, like how the data are collected, what data are collected, how they're organized, how they're accessed, etc. This can all be part of qualification, and this is something that also I would encourage you to look at. So can I have the next slide, please? In practice, what I think is really worthwhile considering now for our future interaction and collaboration is to develop case studies that really see to what extent some research questions can be answered by data enterprises such as Harmony, and then to see how they're fit for purpose and what would be the scientific and regulatory acceptance of the conclusions of such data. And this could be done, let's say, outside the formal process of qualification, which is always an option. But I think in the early stages, it's perhaps better to proceed more, shall I say, in a research setting with publications rather than, let's say, regulatory opinions. And I think this could go a long way in explaining, first of all, what are the type of situations where these methods can be used, but also what are the challenges, perhaps from a regulatory point of view, or more likely from a general scientific point of view, that we all need to address in order to optimize the use of such fantastic tools. Can I have the last slide, please? So to summarize, we are really committed to explore all these very rich data sources and to collaborate, because this is clearly not something that can be done by a single stakeholder or a single player here. There needs to be a collaboration, and I think this is a fantastic opportunity for Harmony and EMA to explore ways of collaboration, either with the systems that we're building, either through the formal interactions of qualification, methodology, and so on. but also I suspect it would be a fantastic opportunity to develop some case studies and really showcase what can be done and somehow perhaps address unnecessary fears that regulatory standards might be inaccessible with anything but the highly controlled clinical trials. No, I think we are used to dealing with other sources of data, and this is one place where I think we will see many developments in the future. And so I'm very optimistic. And Jesus, I'm going to give back the floor to you, and thank you again very much for allowing us to bring our thoughts here, if not in person, at least connected online. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pignatti. I think it is really... So at the time that we started to do this project, we were thinking, I think at any time, to have in the same table patients, scientists, hematologists, industry, regulatory agencies. So now we start to have this. So it is something that after 4 years, and we are trying to, and we are just building this. I'm quite sure that there will be questions here, maybe, or even on the chat. For the questions here, please use the headphone because of the people who is attending virtually. They will perfectly hearing you, and mainly Dr. Pignatti. Thank you so much, Dr. Pignatti, for this presentation. Thank you. Dr. Hellman.
Thanks, Dr. Pignatti, for this informative talk. I learned from your presentation that you are interested in knowledge gain in hematology. I always had the impression that EMA was the agency to protect public health by approving new drugs that provided good evidence for its efficacy and safety. So what is now the strategic goal of EMA? Is it just general knowledge gain, or is it just approval of new drugs? Because this is the topic that is mostly cited in the context of EMA.
Correct, and I tried to allude to this in my first slides. We have a statutory role, which is to assess the marketing authorization applications. But as we've said many times, simply satisfying criteria of quality, safety, and efficacy does not mean that once the drugs are on the market, that there cannot be optimizations. And although we don't have a primary role there, we cannot say force companies to endlessly optimize the benefits and risks of drugs which are on the market. But we are very interested in supporting such efforts. And in fact, we are about to establish, we're discussing this with the RTC, EHA, and others now, establish a multi-stakeholder forum on really seeing how EMA can support the community in prioritizing the research questions that need to be answered once the drugs are on the market. The dose, the better combinations, the duration of treatments, just to give some examples. And you're right, this is not our primary goal then to conduct that research or fund that research. We don't have that mandate, but I think we can use the visibility of drug regulation to support and give voice to some of these initiatives, which I think are in the interest of public health.
Thank you, Professor Lowenberg. And later we have Dr. McIntyre. And we also have a question from the chat. So, okay, go ahead, please, Bob.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, no.
Thank you very much for your stimulating talk, and I think even welcoming thought to explore new territories together and develop new ways of drug assessment and approval. My question is, wouldn't it be useful at some point, since you mentioned the bar is not that high, it's not impossibly high, and we don't aim for perfectionism. Wouldn't it be useful to embark together at least on, for instance, one demonstration project to show that this is a reality and take it from there? Maybe a demonstration project that meets, satisfies the criteria on both sides or on multiple sides. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea. We should showcase some studies or some research opportunities and see not just that they satisfy the regulators, but also that they satisfy the scientific communities. We're a little bit a step before, let's say, writing guidelines about this or anything like that. We just need to showcase that this approach works. What are the strengths and weaknesses, and then regulators and others can criticize this and learn from this. But I'm totally in agreement with you. That's what we would need at the moment, and not so much a formal regulatory review of something, but something that we can develop in collaboration, pick the most likely, most useful scenario where this could be useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. McIntyre?
Why don't you take an online question first?
Oh, no, that doesn't matter.
Okay. I would just like to join the two previous speakers in congratulating you in this move towards collaborative post-market and further developments. My question is biased by the fact that I'm a diagnostic hematologist. And with the new regulations in both medical devices and in vitro diagnostics and companion diagnostics, will there be a move towards closer integration of diagnostics into EMA's activities? And can you say anything about how you see that evolving? And just to finish, I think that's also the model that is going to be used for evaluating data and analytical tools in healthcare. So will the family of therapeutics become a very large one, and how soon is that going to happen?
Yeah, thank you. This is a fantastically relevant question because this is work in progress at the moment, and I don't have the details yet of how it's all going to look. In fact, nobody has, because these things are being defined now. But I am all with you in the sense that I feel that this is a new thing for the drug evaluators to look at companion diagnostics closer and to define criteria of clinical utility. And I sense that there will be a lot there that is similar to the way we evaluate diagnostic drugs. So there will be a lot of, let's say, cross-communication between the two fields. At the same time, we will realize that this is the diagnostics is a different world in many ways. And so the criteria will have to be carefully adapted in a pragmatic sense. And this is, again, bringing us back to harmony. I expect that perhaps for aspects like clinical utility, where perhaps the rigor and precision of clinical trial will not be required, that real-world data could play a much bigger role here in establishing claims on clinical utility and so on. So I think it's a space which we'll be watching with a lot of interest. But let's wait and see what comes out of our working group and how they want to proceed with the assessment, EMA assessment of the clinical utility of companion diagnostics.
Yeah, we have a question from the chat from Professor Gastone Castellani, also a partner in Harmony. And the exact question is, what is the position of EMA about the use of synthetic data generated by artificial intelligence techniques, starting for real data for privacy-preserving purposes and transfer learning?
Well, It's a little bit outside my direct field of expertise, but I think we have lined up a number of data sources which we are looking at with a lot of interest, and this is one of them. And as with any other type of data or new approaches, we, together with you, we want to be guided by you, actually, in telling us what is the scientific and validity and other characteristics of such data, and when we can rely on such type of data, and for what type of research questions. So it's a similar field, perhaps a bit further away still. But again, we'll be looking for you and the scientific community and collaborate if there is an opportunity in really establishing on an evidence basis, like any new scientific methodology, what are the pros and cons of this. So we're open, but the jury is out there.